When we set sail from the last port in search of supplies, we were 20 hungry, exhausted, and desperate men. The sun seemed crueler with each passing day, and the constant rocking of the ship, once comforting, now brought nausea and fatigue. Our provisions had run out days ago, and no one could even recall the last decent meal. Dried food and rationed water were our only companions. The nights were worse, when the ocean's silence amplified our fears, and each man retreated into his own thoughts, mulling over regrets, memories of home, and silent prayers. The crew's gazes were empty, lifeless, except for the hunger that had become an unbearable weight. We knew we couldn't last much longer. Calloused hands worked the oars and sails, not out of hope, but because stopping would mean accepting the end. The ocean seemed infinite, a blue expanse taunting us with its vastness, while denying any promise of salvation. We could hear the creaking of the Valenti's planks, a ship as worn as our bodies. The captain, Armand Leclerc, walked the deck with the rigid posture of a man refusing to yield to despair. He stared at the horizon as if expecting to find answers where the sky met the sea. His presence was an anchor for us all, but even he was beginning to show signs of exhaustion. There was something in his eyes that hadn't been there before, a mix of guilt and helplessness. He knew our chances were slim. We all knew. 5 men had already been lost. One by one they fell, beaten by the heat, thirst, and the sickness that attacked their weakened bodies. Those who still stood were shadows of who they had been at the start of the voyage. Oliver, who always had a joke ready, was now silent. Henri, once the strongest of us all, could barely carry a bucket of water. Jacob, who claimed he never lost faith, no longer prayed. We were ghosts adrift, floating toward the unknown. Arguments were rare. No one had the energy for fights or debates. There was only the monotony of identical days and the slow counting of time. Each sunrise was met with both relief and dread, as it marked another day we had survived, but also another day our luck hadn't changed. Each sunset was a reminder that the night would bring cold and the fear of not seeing another dawn. As time passed, it became difficult to distinguish one day from another. Everything blurred into a single stream of effort, exhaustion, and need. We had no idea the ocean held more than just our hunger, that its vastness concealed a fate that would change our lives forever. We didn't know that the last port we left behind would be the last time we stepped ashore with confidence, and that our journey was only just beginning. The first time we spotted the island, it was as if the horizon itself conspired to offer us hope. It was just a dark line in the distance, surrounded by dense clouds that seemed fixed above it. But to our tired and hungry eyes, it looked like a miracle. There was a moment of disbelief on deck, as if no one wanted to be the first to believe what they were seeing. Some rubbed their eyes, others pointed, and a murmur grew among the men as we drew closer. The captain was the first to break the silence, ordering us to adjust the sails. His voice, firm and authoritative, brought a renewed sense of purpose to the group. There was a sudden burst of energy as we worked to steer the Valente toward what seemed like salvation. The planks creaked beneath our feet, but for the first time in days, the sound felt like a sign of life, not weariness. As we approached, the island revealed more of its features. Dense trees stood like a wall along the coast, their intertwined branches forming a dark green canopy. Black sand beaches glistened under the setting sun, and a narrow river wound through the vegetation, disappearing into a cave that stood out against the backdrop. No one could say where we were, but no one questioned it either. There were no maps marking a place like this, but it didn't matter. It was land, it was water, it was life. Yet not everyone was convinced we'd found a refuge. Henri, with his restless eyes, was the first to mention something about the mist hovering over the island. "It doesn't feel natural," he said, but no one listened. His words were drowned out by the excitement spreading among the group. At last, we had a chance to replenish our supplies and perhaps regain what little strength we had left. Rumors began even before we anchored. Low, nervous whispers passed through the deck. "Cursed lands," someone murmured, recalling old tales of islands that should never be touched. But they were just stories, nonsense to entertain sailors in taverns. Who had time to believe such things when hunger was consuming us? The island seemed so peaceful, so serene, a serenity that, in hindsight, was unsettling, like the calm before a storm. As we dropped anchor and prepared to disembark, the looks exchanged among the men were mixed. Some were filled with relief, others with a quiet unease. No one wanted to be the first to voice doubt, but the tension was palpable. The captain, as always, kept his serious demeanor, ordering us to ready the muskets and barrels for water. "We don't know what we'll find," he said, and those words stayed with me. At the time, though, they seemed like mere caution. After all, what could exist on such a small, isolated island besides peace and resources? We were about to discover the answer was something we could never have imagined. We disembarked from the Valente in small groups, each man carrying the essentials: muskets, machetes, barrels for water, and bags for fruit or anything else we could find. As we moved inland, the air grew heavier, carrying a strange smell, a mix of salt, something sweet, and something rotten. It was a scent we couldn't identify, but it unsettled us deeply. The first thing I noticed was the silence. There were no birds singing, no wind rustling through the leaves. Only the muffled rustle of our footsteps and the soft sound of waves lapping against the shore. The absence of life was so eerie that it made me glance around more cautiously. We headed toward the river we had seen from the ship, hopeful for fresh water. The vegetation was dense, with broadleaf trees blocking much of the sunlight. We pushed through shrubs and vines tangled like living nets, forcing us to carve a path with our machetes. The silence remained oppressive, and the further we ventured into the forest, the sweatier our hands grew on our weapons, and the more wary our gazes became. Eventually, we reached the river. The water was crystal clear. I plunged my hands into the cool stream and drank like a man who hadn't seen fresh water in days. The others did the same, filling barrels as a brief sense of relief spread through the group. But that relief didn't last long. Henri, who seemed to have a knack for noticing what we'd rather ignore, pointed to the riverbank. There, in the damp earth, were tracks. Massive, disproportionate footprints. They weren't like those of any animal we knew. They had the shape of paws, but with strange patterns resembling curved claws. A nervous murmur rippled through the men. Oliver tried to laugh, suggesting they might belong to a large feline, perhaps a leopard. But the forced tone of his voice betrayed what we all knew. It wasn't that. Despite our unease, we continued exploring. We followed the river, gathering fruit from trees that seemed safe, though no one dared eat them yet. After some time, we came across the cave entrance we had spotted from afar. Its opening was a gaping black wound in the green landscape, a promise of mystery and danger. The captain decided we should investigate, though not everyone agreed. A few men, like Henri, stayed behind, unwilling to confront the unknown. As we prepared to enter, the silence was broken by a sound we couldn't place. A soft clicking noise, distant, almost like it was carried by the wind. I exchanged a glance with Oliver, and for the first time since we anchored, I felt pure fear creep into me, sending shivers down my spine. We entered the cave with hesitant steps, the captain's lantern casting flickering light on walls covered in moss. The air inside was heavy, almost suffocating, and carried a smell we quickly recognized as a mix of rusted iron and rotting flesh. The silence, already eerie in the forest, felt even more oppressive within the cave, broken only by the sound of our movements. Every drop of water falling from the stalactites to the ground made the men flinch. The wide entrance began to narrow. Quickly, the ceiling sloped downward, forcing us to crouch, and the rocky walls closed in, making our progress increasingly uncomfortable. We followed in single file, each man relying on the one ahead for guidance. That's when we heard it for the first time. It was subtle, like the faint clicking of stones tapping against each other, but the echo made it sound as if it came from every direction. "Did you hear that?" Oliver asked, stopping abruptly. No one replied, but the looks we exchanged were enough to confirm it wasn't his imagination. We pressed on, each step heavier than the last, until the passage opened into a larger chamber. There, the lantern's light revealed something that made our hearts stop. The walls were covered in webs. They weren't like the spider webs we were used to seeing. These were thick, resembling sticky ropes, and glistened faintly in the light. They hung like grotesque curtains, crossing each other in chaotic patterns. but it was what dangled from them that made us freeze. Bodies. Cocooned in the sticky silk, they hung like dead fruit in a macabre orchard. Some were so decayed their forms were barely recognizable, but others looked recent. One of them caught everyone's attention. It wore a shirt with golden buttons that still gleamed. It was an officer's uniform, possibly from another ship unlucky enough to find this place. As always, Oliver was the first to move closer. "Maybe there's something useful," he said, reaching out to touch one of the webs. The sticky strands clung to his fingers, and he had to tug hard to free himself. "This is strange," he muttered. But before he could say more, the clicking returned. This time, it was louder, faster. It came from the darkness beyond the lantern's reach and seemed to multiply, as if something, or many things, were moving toward us. The eyes appeared first. 6 glowing points, red like embers, emerged from the shadows. Then the legs, moving, with terrifying speed. When the creature finally revealed itself, terror gripped us all. It was massive, larger than any animal we'd ever seen. Its stiff, bristle-like hairs glinting in the lantern light like metallic needles. Its mandibles dripped with a yellowish liquid, and the sound it made as it moved was horrifying. Oliver screamed, but the sound was abruptly cut off as the creature lunged. Its sharp legs lifted him as if he were made of paper, and in seconds he was cocooned in those grotesque webs. The captain shouted orders, but most of us were already firing, our muskets in sheer panic. The bullets either ricocheted off its body or seemed to do little more than irritate it. The piercing sound emitted by the creature was joined by more clicking noises all around us. It wasn't alone. Panic erupted. Jacob was next. He stumbled as he backed away and barely had time to get up before another creature reached him. This one was even larger, with glowing red markings on its abdomen. Its attack was swift, merciless. Jacob was immobilized, his tendons severed with terrifying precision as he screamed for help. No one could assist him. The group scattered. Each man ran in a different direction, shouting, shooting, desperately trying to escape. I stayed close to the captain, who grabbed my arm and forced me to follow him down one of the smaller tunnels. As we ran, the sound of clicking echoed all around us, and every shadow seemed to conceal another threat. We passed through a smaller chamber where we found 2 of our own. One hung from the ceiling, eyes wide open but lifeless, while the other lay on the ground, partially devoured. The sight made me stagger, but the captain shoved me forward, muttering something about not stopping. We reached a tunnel that seemed to lead to the exit, but the cost was steep. Sebastian, one of the strongest among us, decided to stay behind, giving us a chance to flee. He held a torch, swinging it wildly to keep the spiders at bay. "Run! Save yourselves!" were his last words before he was overwhelmed. I glanced back one final time, watching the light of his torch vanish as the clicking noises grew louder. At last, we emerged into the fresh air. But there were so few of us left. The weight of what we'd left behind was crushing. The air in the forest felt different when we finally emerged from the cave. Only 4 of us remained: the captain, Donovan, Peter, and me. Each of us wore an expression that blended disbelief with absolute terror. The creatures hadn't followed us. "We can't stay here," the captain said, his voice low and urgent. "They might come out. We need to get back to the ship." His words made sense. We were frozen, each battling the horrific images we couldn't erase. The glowing eyes, the bodies wrapped in webs, the screams of those we left behind. The weight was unbearable, but the thought of staying in the forest forced us to move. The path back to the ship, which had once seemed clear, was now unrecognizable. The dense vegetation felt more oppressive, and every sound, whether the rustling of leaves or the distant cry of a bird, sent our hearts racing. Donovan, usually confident and even arrogant, was muttering to himself, repeating Jacob's name as if it were a mantra. Peter, the youngest, gripped his knife so tightly that his knuckles were white. I couldn't bring myself to speak. Everything felt too fragile, as if a single word might shatter what little control we had left. We walked for hours, or at least it felt that way, until the sound of the ocean finally reached our ears. The sight of the beach should have brought relief, but instead, it stirred something darker. Our ship was there, but something was wrong. Very wrong. The sails were torn, hanging like ghosts from the mast. The wood, once sturdy, was marked by deep gashes, as if something large and sharp had attacked it. There were tracks in the sand, deep grooves leading from the forest to the hull. It was clear the creatures weren't confined to the cave. They had come here. "This isn't possible," Peter murmured, breaking the silence. His voice trembled as much as his hands. The captain approached the ship, moving like a man about to face his own execution. He climbed the partially destroyed plank, with Donovan following close behind. Peter and I hesitated, but we knew we couldn't stay on the beach. The inside of the ship was desolate. Crates were opened, barrels shattered, tools scattered as if it had been attacked in a frenzy. But it wasn't the destruction that made us stop. It was the smell. The same smell from the cave. Iron and rot. "They've been here," the captain said in a low voice. "And they've gone back to the forest." Donovan started laughing. It wasn't a laugh of relief, but a hysterical, broken sound. "We're dead," he said between laughs. "They'll get us. It doesn't matter where we go." No one tried to calm him. Maybe because, deep down, we knew he was right. The captain began assessing the damage, searching for a solution. "If we can patch the sails and reinforce the hull quickly, we can leave by morning. We need to get away from this island before nightfall." Peter and I were assigned to gather usable materials from the nearby forest. Despite the terror, we knew it was our only chance. We grabbed what we could, sturdy branches, strong vines, and ran back to the ship. The captain and Donovan worked frantically, fixing what they could as the sun dipped below the horizon. Darkness began to settle, and with it came the sound. Faint at first, almost imperceptible, but impossible to ignore. The clicking. Peter was the first to hear it, stopping in the middle of tying a knot. He looked at me, his eyes wide. "They're coming." The captain ordered us to hurry, but we all knew time wasn't on our side. The forest's shadows seemed alive, the clicking louder, closer. With every moment, the line between reality and pure terror blurred further. All we could do was race against the clock, hoping it wasn't already too late. Night fell quickly. The darkness was almost absolute, interrupted only by the weak glow of our lanterns and the pale light of the moon reflected on the sea. The silence was filled only by the sound of our heavy breathing, the noise of the calm sea, and the occasional rustling of the trees in the wind. But we knew we were not alone. The clicks, now closer, made it impossible to ignore the fact that the creatures were surrounding us. "Keep working," the captain ordered, his voice low and urgent. He kept his eyes fixed on the tree line while gripping the hilt of his sword, so tightly that it seemed ready to break. Peter by my side was trembling uncontrollably, but still managed to tie the last knots in the patched sails. Donovan held a torch in hand, lighting it with a determined expression, although the fear in his eyes was evident. The first attack was so fast that we barely had time to react. Something emerged from the forest with an agile and lethal movement, knocking Peter down before he could scream. The sound of his body being dragged into the darkness was followed by a high-pitched scream that was quickly cut off. The captain shouted, forcing us to stay focused. "Hold your positions! Don't let them get near the ship!" The shadows around us seemed to move, and from within them, more creatures emerged. The huge legs and glowing eyes were visible in the torchlight, but that didn't slow them down. Donovan screamed as he attacked one with the torch, forcing it to retreat for a few seconds. But others took its place, advancing with frightening speed. We ran to the deck of the ship, trying to use the structure as an improvised barrier. One of the creatures jumped, clinging to the hull and swinging like a monstrous weight. Donovan managed to push it back to the ground with the torch, but in the process he lost his balance and fell next to it. The sound that followed, the dry crack of breaking bones and the scream that was soon cut off, left us knowing there was no hope left for him. Now it was just the captain and me, trapped on the deck of a ship that was far from ready to set sail. The creatures moved around us, their clicks increasing in intensity as if they were communicating, coordinating the final attack. I couldn't think, barely could breathe. All that remained was instinct. "Prepare yourself," the captain shouted, tossing me a pistol while he wielded his sword with a near-suicidal determination. "If we're going to die here, let it be fighting." The creatures advanced, and chaos took over. We fired our weapons, but the bullets seemed to have little effect. One of the creatures leaped onto the deck, knocking the captain down, who faced it, slashing with his sword while it tried to impale him with its sharp legs. His scream echoed as he was struck, but his last action was to push the creature away, giving me a chance to climb the mast. Up there, I looked at what was left. The deck was overrun by creatures, and the captain's body was sprawled next to them. The sight was terrifying, but against all odds, a gust of wind filled the patched sails. The ship began to move, slowly pulling away from the shore. The creatures didn't seem willing to give up so easily. Some tried to climb the hull, while others simply watched us from the coast. I, alone and terrified, used everything I could to push back those still aboard, burning them with torches and cutting the webs they threw. After what felt like hours, the ship finally gained enough distance for the creatures to retreat, disappearing back into the forest. But the silence that followed didn't bring relief. I was alone in the middle of the sea, with a damaged ship, limited supplies, and the memory of everything that had happened. Even so, the strongest sensation wasn't sadness or fear. It was the certainty that something from that island was watching me, even from afar. I could feel its eyes, bright and hungry, following me as the island's mist faded into the horizon. The following days were a blur of fear and exhaustion. The ship, although it had taken me away from that damned island, still seemed like a place of pure terror. The burnt smell of webs and the remnants of my companions were everywhere. The deck was stained with blood. The torn sails fluttered like ghosts in the wind, and the creaking of the planks seemed to mourn in my place. I spent the first hours after escaping inspecting the hold, hoping that none of the creatures had managed to hide there. My lantern cast frightening shadows on the walls, and every sound, no matter how small, made me spin around quickly, eyes wide, pistol ready. When I finally confirmed I was alone, I fell to my knees, my body shaking with relief and terror. But the calm didn't last long. It was on the third night that I realized the hell had not yet ended. I was lying in the captain's cabin, where the maps and notes he had scribbled remained scattered. I was trying to make sense of his confused notes, something about the location of the island and why it wasn't on the maps, when I heard it. A low click, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. I jumped to my feet, knocking over the inkpot on the table. My heart pounded so loudly it seemed to echo through the cabin. I grabbed the pistol and the lantern, hesitating to open the door, but I knew I had to investigate. I walked down the hallway toward the hold, each step echoing like a scream in the silence. In the hold, the air was heavier. There was an unusual humidity, and the lantern's light revealed something that made my stomach turn. Strands of silk, glowing in the dim light. They were small, almost imperceptible, but they were there. The webs were back. The click repeated, louder now, coming from a dark corner. I raised the lantern and, for a moment, wished I had never looked. One of the creatures was there, smaller than the ones on the island, but still monstrous. Its legs were long and thin, with hairs that looked like sharp blades. Its eyes, 6 glowing points, were fixed on me. It was weaving something, and behind it was a small tangle of rat bodies, still fresh. Before I could react, it lunged at me. I fired, the sound of the shot deafening in the enclosed space. The bullet hit it, but it wasn't enough to kill it. The creature writhed, letting out a sharp sound that made my ears hurt, before disappearing into the shadows of the hold. I knew I couldn't leave it like that. I ran back to the deck, searched for oil and torches, and went back down. The smell of burning filled the space as I set the webs alight. The flames illuminated the walls, revealing more of the sticky threads. As the fire spread, I heard a muffled sound, something between a squeal and a growl. The creature tried to escape, but the flames caught it. Its carcass emitted grotesque pops as it burned. When I finally put out the fire to prevent the entire ship from being destroyed, I sat on the deck, exhausted. Tears fell uncontrollably. I was alive, but at what cost? The ship was still afloat, but I knew something inside me had changed. Fear was like a permanent shadow, a weight I would never be able to leave behind. Even in the middle of the ocean, surrounded by the vast blue, I felt like I would never truly leave that island. It was etched into me, in my body and my mind. And, deep down, I knew that no matter how far I sailed, the terror would follow me forever. The last night at sea was a silent chaos. The sails were torn, the masts creaked with the wind, and the sky above me seemed as empty as my hope. I still heard the sounds of that hell, echoes of the creatures, as if they had been recorded in my mind. There was no rest, not even in the darkness. When I finally saw land on the horizon, I thought it was a mirage. But as I got closer, I realized it was real. My escape had led me to a small port. Disembarking felt like waking up from a nightmare, but a bitter awakening. The village was simple, with a few wooden buildings and a small open-air market. People stared at me with curiosity and suspicion. It wasn't surprising. I looked like a walking corpse, with sunburned skin, a grown-out beard, tattered clothes, and deep eyes that surely reflected the horror I had lived through. A man approached. He had the posture of someone used to dealing with strangers, perhaps a merchant or some kind of local leader. He asked where I came from and why I was alone. When I tried to explain, I stumbled over my words. I told him my crew had perished on an isolated island, but I didn't go into details. How could I explain something I still didn't fully understand? I was taken to a tavern where they gave me food and water. Despite being starving, my stomach rejected most of it. The simple taste of the bread felt wrong, almost strange, as if my body had forgotten what normality was. The warmth of the fire in the hearth also bothered me, reminding me of the flames that consumed those cursed webs. As for me, I spent days in a cramped room in the tavern, and I write these words not as a warning, but as a confession. There's no way to warn the world, because the world will never believe it. But if by chance you spot an island surrounded by dark, lifeless fog, with trees that seem more like shadows than wood, do not approach. Do not stop. After all, what dwells there is not of this world. And I should not have survived to tell this sinister story.